Hey guys, so Trump just won. He beat last night Kamala. Sorry, I promise I'll never do that again. I don't know why I did that. But he won the election. So in this episode, I thought while I wait for my son to finish his soccer game, let's discuss the 4 ways that I think this win for Trump could impact Australian and therefore Australian house prices. Of course, we sometimes make a big deal, try to make a connection where there may not actually be one for the sake of creating content, but I think there could be real consequences. So let's see where it goes. Our Facebook group blew up yesterday. There were all sorts of discussion on the economic politics of the election victory for Trump, which, to be honest, I don't think most people thought would happen. So a lot of people have been caught unaware. And I think when that happens, I'm not saying money markets, I think money markets knew it was coming, but a lot of people, especially on the left, because we all live in our echo chambers, they or we or whatever, the lefts didn't probably see it coming. And so it's really important to understand the impact, which may be surprising for a lot of you. So let's go into it. Number one, so I just have consumed so much content, online, as we all have, I'm sure. So every time I, start to think of words like China, automatically the way that Trump says it comes into mind, like China, which I'm gonna avoid saying it because it's really cringe. But China is going to be impacted in a big way. So one thing that Trump has definitely said is that China, they may impose up to 60% tariffs, whether it's on all goods and services or just some buckets of goods and services coming from China into the US. And of course, that's because he wants to boost local manufacturing in the US. He wants to bolster the local jobs, especially in the Rust Belt. That manufacturing, by the way, is a hallmark of a really strong economy and a robust middle class. And the manufacturing, after China, the US has the most manufacturing in the whole world, but it's been slipping. Of course, here in Australia, as we know, Holden, Ford, etc., it's basically not there anymore, which is a big problem for us. It keeps us very reliant on a few industries. But he wants to do that. He wants to put tariffs on China. Now, of course, Australia, as much as our politicians and maybe the people of Australia, I don't know, what do you think? As much as from a social perspective, I feel that the zeitgeist or the politics in Australia, people don't love China as much as they could, maybe. I'm not saying the Chinese people, but just China as an ideology, as a country. They maybe don't love them as much as they could, but the reality is Australia relies on China. If China goes kaput, then Australia goes kaput. So this is a huge risk if China suffers big time. And of course, they've been putting out their stimulus right now. They're trying to bolster the economy. Their local housing market's been terrible for the last few years now. That's just starting to show some green shoots. Now, if Trump comes along and puts a bulldozer or, one of those rollers, when you create a cricket pitch, you have one of those heavy rollers to flatten the pitch, puts one of those rollers on those green shoots of the Chinese economy by putting in tariffs up to 60%, then that means China, it's not going to fare well. And China will therefore then import or need or demand less energy, especially in the form of iron ore from Australia. Now, that's not going to be great for WA and Queensland markets. So these two markets, I'm not saying don't buy there. I'm not saying that there's going to be a price drop immediately, but they're susceptible to anything Trump does. Now, the second thing to note is that I think it's really important to understand that he's actually looking to impart 10% tariffs worldwide. Once again, with this mood of bolstering this America first ideology or principle. So, of course, America is not the biggest trade partner with Australia, but we do export things to them. So if all of a sudden everything that we export to them becomes 10% more expensive, then that means there's less demand for Australian goods and services into America, which means that then they obviously demand less from Australia, and that takes a little bit of a toll on the Australian economy. Now, that would obviously mean that our GDP, which is, to be honest, not great, not bad, it's not a recession, but last thing we need is downward pressure on GDP growth, especially with the RBA so far behind, perhaps for good reason, in lowering interest rates, and therefore the economy versus other global economies is still facing really strong headwinds with such high interest rates. Sometimes people say our interest rates aren't as high as our peers, especially in the G7 or what have you, but actually our interest rates on a weighted average basis in Australia are the highest in the world almost, yes, especially amongst the G20. And that's because a lot of other countries like the US have 30-year mortgages, and so when they lifted interest rates, it didn't impact everyone, whereas in Australia, it impacted almost everyone. So on a weighted average mortgage, average variable lending rate, or real lending rate, because it's an average of variable and fixed, we have the highest interest rate that mortgage holders are facing. So we're still very soft as an economy, and if these added things pile up, with reduced demand for our goods from overseas, then that could really, it's like, the straw that broke the camel's back. We don't know if this is going to be the straw. There may not be a straw, but certainly not a good thing. The other thing I want to talk to you about as well is inflationary pressure. Now, inflation is a great thing for hard assets like real estate. People think that inflation is a bad thing. It is a bad thing. Hyperinflation, that is, or inflation consistently above 3, 4, 5%. It's not good for cost of living. It reduces real wages, real incomes, puts people under pressure. And that's actually probably the majority of which was Trump's base that voted him back in, both in the Electoral College and also the popular vote. But I will want to say that there is one thing that Trump has, and he can implement almost right away, that could significantly reduce inflation both in the US and globally, and that is energy prices. In terms of LNG or natural gas, the US has so much of it that they don't know what to do with it. And the same can be said of oil, but they just don't utilize it. They don't drill it enough. Well, I shouldn't say enough, because that's a value judgment from my perspective, which no one really needs. But they haven't fully tapped their potential, let's say, especially in places like Pennsylvania, where a lot of this resource exists. So he could effectively open up the taps for these types of commodities, and of course it takes time to then flow through to the money markets, through to the economy, global markets, importers worldwide, etc. But generally futures markets, as soon as they see the tap open, the futures markets for oil and gas, etc., can change very quickly. So you might see the forward trading on these types of energy costs go down big time, and then it takes roughly 60 to 90 days for spot prices to be affected. So literally, as soon as he gets, actually takes the oath early next year, we could see 3 months after that, let's say April, May time, energy prices really come down. And of course that impacts everything in the economy, because almost everything requires oil, right? Almost everything requires gas, or at least some sort of energy. And so that could really take the sting away from inflation globally. And of course, the sting has already been taken away. Inflation is already within the reasonable bounds of most, or if not all, central banks. The only exception really amongst developed nations is Australia, because our government seems to not want to stop spending, and that is why our inflation is still stubborn. So if Trump does this, then that could actually be a great thing for inflation, which of course for hard asset prices like property is not a good thing. Hard asset prices go up big time with ongoing hyperinflation or high inflation. But then the contrary point, or the flip side, is if inflation does start to subdue, then we could see interest rates here finally. You know, maybe Michelle, our governor, I'm on a first name basis with her. I'm just joking. You know, early next year, she could start reducing interest rates earlier than expected. And of course, let's see, I don't subscribe to this, you know, property commentator mood that interest rate reductions will boom property prices. But if immigration stays the way that it is and interest rates drop, you know, 1%, you know, like 100 basis points, and we could see another boom potentially. But 1 or 2 drops, 25 to 50 basis points, I don't think is going to cause any property boom. Of course, markets within markets. The last thing I want to talk about, I've talked about 3 things so far. Fourth thing I want to talk about real quick is immigration. So obviously Trump, he's always said he's against illegal immigration. Fair enough, I guess. He's always for legal immigration. He's pro that. Now, of course, you know, with the Trump presidency, people are triggered in various ways, both locally and for globally. A lot of people who are migrating into the US are from China, from India, other Asian nations, almost everywhere basically. They may think they don't want to go to a place like the US where in their mind, maybe they're left-leaning, I don't know, there's like a dictator or a fascist, not my words, right? You know, in charge, or they don't want to be taking any risks with their visas, rolling over their visas because he might make changes or whatever. They probably want to leave their own countries anyway because of whatever reason. So they may say, look, we want to see other places where we can go to. Do they want to go to Canada? It's pretty easy to get into Canada, but Australia is always a safe haven, politically safe, politically stable, wealthy nation. We have some of the highest wages anywhere. People don't realize that our housing costs the way it does until they get here, poor immigrants. You know, they don't see what's coming. So we might see more immigration coming to Australia. Of course, we don't have the illegal immigration problem, but more and more legal immigration may come in a spillover of what would have gone to America, but now may not because of how people perceive the foreign policy, immigration policy in the US starting in 2025. Of course, we have a massive housing shortage in Australia. The government wants to build 1.2 million houses. It ain't happening. We don't have enough skilled laborers, enough materials, and even that is not enough to meet our demand both locally and with a reasonable amount of immigration, let alone what's going on right now. If that immigration goes up even more, then house prices are just going to, you know, go through the roof even more. Of course, right now Sydney, Melbourne are tapering off a little bit, but you know, all of this could change with more and more and more and more and more immigration. So I've talked about these 4 things. I talked about China and its impact with tariffs globally. That was the second thing. The third thing I talked about was energy costs, energy prices impact on global immigration. And then we talked about global inflation, and we talked about migration into Australia, you know, as a spillover of what would have otherwise gone into the US. So you can see these opposing forces here. It's not like they're all pointing in one direction, which is Australia good, house prices up, or versus Australia bad, house prices down. It's nuanced, but I think watch this space. But I want to know what you think. I'm definitely not a political expert, although I do like to follow politics. But I want to understand what you think. What do you think the Trump presidency, how will that impact Australia? Guys, please don't be triggered, especially if you're on the left. None of what I've said today is about social policy or social concerns. Let's not get into what Trump is or is not from a social perspective. Let's stick to economics. That's what I'm really passionate about. That's what this channel is about. So I'm keen to understand what your thoughts are as well. And please share this as well with people who may be triggered either socially or economically by what's happened last night with the presidential election. If they want more juice, more color, more information about how it impacts Australia and Australian economics and house prices. My name's PK. Hit the subscribe button, give it a thumbs up. Hopefully this was a timely update, and I wish you guys a balanced political future. See you later, guys. Bye.